From the PGA Tour suspending LIV golfers' memberships to the breakaway league filing an antitrust lawsuit against them, the PGA Tour versus LIV golf rivalry is arguably one of the most fascinating sagas in sporting history. And it all started when the tour suspended Saudi League members. Now, of course, it's not like they did it without any reason. The truth is that the upstart circuit had been making waves for a while, and it was genuinely threatening to take over the PGA Tour. The last straw for the association, however, was when LIV also decided to sign players who were already contracted by the tour. I mean, sure, players compete on other tours around the world all the time, but the difference here was that the Saudi-funded league wasn't just another tour trying to cater to a different audience. They only had one goal: to end the PGA Tour's quote-unquote monopoly over the sport and become the premier golfing competition. Spearheaded by Aussie legend Greg Norman, they signed a bunch of PGA stars like Phil Mickelson, Dustin Johnson, and Bryson DeChambeau, and gave them massive contracts, with some of them going upwards of $200 million. So obviously, the tour wasn't just going to let that slip and allow them to compete in its events, while also breaching their contracts. Like, you can't have your cake and eat it too, right? And thus began this feud that doesn't seem to have an end. Seriously, it's been over a year, and we've seen so much back and forth between the two parties. From Norman throwing all sorts of shade toward PGA Tour members to them firing back at the league. It's been non-stop. And yet we've got no solution in sight. In fact, if anything, things have gotten even worse over time. After all, the PGA Tour antitrust lawsuit was arguably the turning point for this rivalry, because initially it was just about trash talk and trying to compete. Like, the tour even switched up its schedule to introduce elevated events with bigger prize purses and all that, just so they could stop the outflow of players to LIV. But this is where things got a bit tricky. The players from the Saudi-funded league believed that the tour was trying to establish a monopoly by barring them from events. And to some extent, they were right. I mean, it's a given that the PGA would want to maintain its reign at the top of all golfing competitions. So LIV members got together and sued the tour for unjustly using its power to stifle competition and punish defectors. Oh, and it didn't take long for LIV Golf to enter the lawsuit in an official capacity either. Their thing was that they should be able to compete in PGA Tour events because technically the breakaway league wasn't direct competition. It was an alternative to traditional golf, with shorter rounds, smaller fields, and no cuts. That said, now that their organization was involved, the players didn't deem it necessary to go through all the legal trouble, meaning the majority stepped back, making it strictly a LIV versus PGA Tour affair. And well, beyond this point, things got really nasty, especially with the upstart circuit accusing the tour of doing a bunch of shady stuff. For instance, they claimed that the PGA was directly involved in organizing and setting up protests outside LIV events. What protests? Well, since the league's funding came from Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund, people had a ton of concerns over all the human rights issues. You know, from the alleged murder of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi to the September 11 attacks. LIV's own player Phil Mickelson even described the Saudi government as scary, which landed him in some trouble too. But essentially, the first few LIV events were filled with people lining up and protesting against these issues. In fact, families of 9/11 victims came forward and spoke against the golfing circuit, which of course did put things into perspective. And this was the thing that the PGA Tour was accused of organizing apparently, albeit through a third party. Oh, and trust me, the Saudi League had a ton of ammo on this. So much so that the Department of Justice also got involved to investigate the PGA for possible antitrust violations. Not to mention the public opinion that started to sway in LIV's favor, especially after they signed star player Cam Smith. The allegations didn't just stop there though, because the league also accused the tour of dissuading broadcast partners. And again, they seem to have some evidence to prove it as well. You see, LIV Golf didn't have a TV partnership for the entirety of its first season. Instead, they streamed their events for free on their website and YouTube, which of course resulted in a pretty big loss in revenue. That said, Norman did promise everyone that talks were ongoing between his league and a bunch of interested parties, some of which included big sports networks like ESPN, Fox, and CNBC. But after months and months of negotiations, nothing came to fruition. Well, at least until they signed with the CW network out of desperation, because they needed something. Now, don't get me wrong, the CW is great, but it's not exactly a sports network, is it? In fact, LIV's second season is the first major sporting event it's broadcasting. So what went wrong? Well, apparently the PGA Tour actively dissuaded potential TV partners, even threatening to cut ties if they did business with LIV. Which of course meant that not only did companies like ESPN turn their backs on the league, but one even refused to proceed with a signed agreement. Yeesh! And of course, these tactics seem to have worked too, because as things stand right now, LIV has about a tenth of the viewership that an average PGA Tour event gets. I mean, the situation is pretty bad, and Greg Norman thinks that the tour's to be blamed for these bad numbers. But of course, the PGA wasn't just gonna sit back and watch the Australians slander them all day long. Nope, they filed a countersuit against LIV. In fact, this happened about 2 months after the Saudi League's original antitrust allegations, and they argued that it was LIV Golf who had done the illegal thing here. What exactly, you ask? Well, they said that the circuit and the Saudi Public Investment Fund wrongly interfered in PGA's business by offering big money deals to their players. After all, this meant that these former PGA Tour members were enticed by cash to break their contracts and compete in the Saudi League instead. Now, the breakaway circuit obviously responded by saying that the investment fund is simply a source of money and nothing else. But who were they kidding? I mean, most reports suggest that the PIF's president, Yasir Al-Rumayyan, is heavily involved with the decision-making process for the league. Also, apparently, he's fired a bunch of top-level LIV executives as well, including Chief Operating Officer Atul Khosla. So, in the end, the judge sided with the tour and allowed it to treat the investment fund as a defendant in its LIV suit. With that said, while the two entities have been locking horns in this legal battle, the situation on the course is actually a bit less intense. The players themselves, for instance, don't seem to hold any animosity toward each other. In fact, we've seen multiple people call for peace talks between LIV Golf and the PGA Tour. Though a lot of pros like Tiger Woods and Rory McIlroy do say that Greg Norman would have to step down for that to happen, all because he's too controversial. But let's be fair, that's not gonna happen anytime soon. So, as players continue to play separately while hanging out with each other off the golf course, the actual chasm in the fabric of the sport continues to widen. And even if things don't seem as serious right now, this never-ending feud could genuinely damage golf in the long run. On that note, this was everything you needed to know about the PGA versus LIV feud. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.